Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I'm from the Midwest. If anyone's from St. Louis in the audience, I would be surprised. But if you've gone to St. Louis, maybe a little hand raise. Okay, that makes me feel good. But yeah, I was born in the Midwest, and I was always really passionate about, plants and animals. I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian, but it wasn't until I went to school and decided to study environmental science more formally that I just really fell in love with it. And unfortunately, during that time, as I'm sure we'll touch on, when I began my major all the way off in school in Southern California, my hometown of Ferguson, Florissant, um, was really erupting with the Black Lives Matter movement after the police officer involved shooting of Michael Brown. So when I began my studies as an environmental science student, I was also really paying close attention to what was going on back home as my parents were participating in protests and my sister and my friend. And I was really just coming to terms with my Black identity and also my womanhood and learning about environmentalism at the same time. And through that, I think, especially because of the events that happened so close to home, my environmental education is kind of enmeshed with social justice advocacy. So that's something that just has gone on throughout my career. And I'm sure many other, environmentalists of color have a similar approach to environmentalism as well. So that's a little bit about my backstory. From the Midwest, went to school, California, dabbled as a National Park Service ranger intern. I worked in the outdoor industry for a little bit at Patagonia headquarters for about 2 years in Ventura. So I tried to go to all the spaces, but in a lot of them, there was a really serious lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a consistent theme in academia, nonprofits, corporations. So I really just wanted to start raising awareness for these issues. I think my greatest accomplishment is probably the nonprofit Intersectional Environmentalist. While I might be a spokesperson at times for just climate justice and intersectional environmentalism, the work is really important to me. And having an organization of like 10 employees, trying to create a work structure that feels really healthy for them. So having a 4-day work week, really investing in like 2-week summer breaks and 2-week winter breaks, and really just reimagining what environmental justice-based work can look like. So trying to create avenues for people who are interested in this work to be able to do so in a way that also promotes wellness, because there's a lot of heavy topics at play when we're talking about environmental injustice. So I think being able to experiment with what a healthy work environment can look like at a nonprofit, especially for an organization that's primarily people of color, is probably my greatest accomplishment. Because even when people leave the organization, they take those expectations with them to the next place that they go to. And I really hope it just shakes up how nonprofits treat and compensate their employees and prioritize their wellness. So that's something that I'm really excited about, that happens really behind the scenes, but is all connected to the work that I do. What really surprises me is that, so I guess sometimes when people read my book, it's an introductory level. I wanted to start at the 100 level so anyone could read it. So I've gotten middle schoolers, high schoolers, and I think, some people who are, it's also kind of read in some colleges. But then I've also had people who are in their 40s and 50s who have been environmentalists or conservationists for a long time, but haven't really thought about things like intersectional theory or ecofeminism or queer ecology or, disability justice and how that connects to environmentalism. So yeah, writing that introduction, the introductory text has been, interesting and really fun. And I think, what's the question? What surprises me the most?
Yeah, what surprises you kind of?
I was going off on a tangent. But yeah, I think that's what surprises me the most, just how many people are new to this, because maybe I'm always interacting with people in the environmental space and a lot of environmental justice advocates. So people already know those intersections. But then again, every time I step into a classroom of high schoolers, it really just warms my heart every time there's, a Black student or a student of color and their eyes just open up and they say like, oh my gosh, I've never heard about the story behind intersectional theory, and now I can connect that to environmentalism. Like I feel seen. So it shocks me sometimes that even after these last couple of years, or even after environmental justice has been a field of study since the 1980s, that it's still new and emerging. So much so that even with our federal government, we're finally starting to see some environmental justice type commitments, or a Black head of the EPA, etc. So I do get surprised at times, but I think that's why I want to continue writing at the 101 level, because there's so many people who don't know about it, and I want it to be as accessible as possible and for people to have a starting place. But you'd be surprised, like people's eyes really open up. Even I remember I was speaking to a church. I'm not religious, but I studied religious studies as a minor, and just seeing their eyes open when I was talking to them about, biblical themes that are also encouraging people to care for the earth. And they're like, oh, I'm an environmentalist because of this, that, and the other. And just seeing people get excited when they can connect their identity to environmentalism. It shocks me in a really beautiful way, just making those connections with people. Yeah, so when I was in college and when I look back on it, I guess you don't know when things are happening that it's a critical moment in your life. But okay, I studied environmental science and policy. The uprisings of Ferguson happened at the exact same time. There's also a lot of talks, it's around 2014, 2015. Like the Women's March was happening like in these couple of years, learning a lot about feminism as well. And I remember I was going to school in Orange County. I was one of the only Black students in my environmental science program. I was really passionate about social justice and feminism, but I found myself in what I now know to be non-intersectional feminist spaces. So I was in spaces where we were talking about the advocacy of women, and there I am like, okay, yeah, the Black Lives Matter movement is going on, so we really need to be talking about Black women and Indigenous women and trans women. But there are some non-intersectional feminists who have a very visceral reaction or a lot of fragility to talking about those overlapping factors that might impact someone's womanhood. And they might say things along the lines of whether their intentions are good or bad, but it's rooted in fragility of, well, we're all women. Why do we have to talk about race? Why do we have to talk about this? We're all women. But it's so important to talk about it, as I'm sure all of us know, because the pay gap is not equal for everyone. It's different for Black women. It's different for Indigenous women. It's different for Latino women, etc. So I was trying to figure out what was going on when I was in college, why I didn't feel connected to the Women's March, why I didn't feel connected to this certain type of feminism. And that's when I learned about intersectional theory and Black feminism that explores those overlapping identities. And as the book explores, it talks about things that existed before intersectional theory. It goes into some really amazing Black women who were very present during the civil rights movement, and we're asking similar questions of like, okay, we as Black women are pouring our emotional labor into the civil rights movement, but sometimes their voices, they weren't being amplified in the same ways as male activists. So during that time, there was kind of an emerging Black feminism that was being created. So long story short, intersectional theory builds off of that Black feminist theory, and explores overlapping identities and how it can be very dangerous to not consider those compounding factors. And not to be too nerdy, but I feel like this is a great example in the book, because the basis of intersectional theory starts in the legal system with Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. There was a General Motors case where the General Motors, they fired all the Black women in the office. So the Black women thought they had a very clear case about discrimination because all the Black women were fired in this department. And this was during the 60s. So they thought when they went to court, signed, sealed, delivered, everything, this is so clear. However, their case was dismissed on the basis that it couldn't be a civil rights violation because there were still Black men working at the office. And this can't be gender-based discrimination because there's still white women working at the office. So then all of the Black women, it was unfair because it was a combination of those two factors. So the argument was ignoring how there can be compounding factors, whether we're talking about race, income, gender, whatever it is, how those things can compound and lead to a specific outcome. That's what intersectional theory is. And that's why we need to pay attention to those compounding factors. So intersectional environmentalism comes from intersectional feminism that considers those two things, race and gender, when intersectional environmentalism is doing a similar thing, asking who is being the most impacted by environmental injustices. And there are a lot of compounding factors. Two of the most common ones are race and income. Sometimes you'll see people that try to say, well, it's a wealth inequality issue. It has nothing to do with racism. But again, it's important to consider those two things or multiple factors and how that's contributing to who is experiencing certain environmental outcomes. So I felt similar things that I felt in those non-intersectional feminist spaces while I was working at very prominent environmental companies and environmental classrooms. I felt that same icky feeling of people aren't considering these compounding factors and identities. So I thought there needs to be an intersectional approach to environmentalism where environmental justice is crucial to it and it's not an optional add-on. Because if it's an add-on, then people aren't going to care about the liberation and safety of people of color and other, vulnerable communities because it's considered optional. Yeah, I would say it's actually dangerous. Like, there's also fun parts to intersectional environmentalism that we'll talk about, just like the beautiful stories of women and people of color and, queer ecology. There's a lot of like beauty to it too. I don't want to just get, in the trauma, but we have to talk about trauma as well. So, taking a non intersectional approach to environmentalism is what leads to 71% of African Americans in the United States living in counties that frequently violate federal air quality standards, which is leading to an increase in respiratory illnesses and asthma. Not taking an intersectional approach to environmentalism leads to policies that further enable structural racism. So we see that lower income communities and Black and Brown communities live in what's called a toxic donut in environmental speak, where our cities are built on top of toxic waste, surrounded with highways, landfills are more common in our neighborhoods, and even things like less trees, less parks, less green spaces. So not thinking about inequity when you're talking about environmentalism is impacting people's livelihoods. I would make the argument that when you have your basic needs met, which isn't even, there's like the hierarchy of needs. If you don't have clean air, your air is polluted, you don't have clean water, how can you experience joy? And it is revolutionary, in my opinion, that there are so many Black and Brown communities who, regardless of all of these issues, are still finding joy, finding community, etc. But we shouldn't have to, everyone should just have clean air and water. So yeah, that's what goes wrong when you don't take an intersectional approach to environmentalism. And also, I think a lot of people, if they're not reflected in environmental education, they might think that they're not an environmentalist. So if there's no stories about diverse populations and everyone's just learning about John Muir or a very white male centric type of environmentalism, like maybe we learn about Rachel Carson. That's kind of like a typical thing in environmental education. There's like a couple women that we might learn about, but not a whole lot. Then there's children who are not seeing themselves reflected in environmentalism. And I think that's changing who decides to go into science and STEM careers. So there's also a lot of beauty of making sure that we infuse environmental education with diversity so more people can say, oh, okay, it is my duty to care for the earth. I am a part of this. You know, my ancestors are a part of environmental history. And I think that's really empowering. Yeah, so during the summer of 2020, I started talking a lot online about my frustrations with the environmental community. At the time, I was actually furloughed from my job, as many people were, and I was working in the outdoor industry. And this will forever stick with me. But months before the pandemic, I was at a protest about protecting salmon. So I was taking it to the streets, talking about the salmon, protect the salmon, protect the salmon. And then during the Black Lives Matter movement, some people I stood beside in protests about the smallest of organisms were not showing up for my people. And it made me realize just so, it was heartbreaking, but I can no longer take part in a type of environmentalism that doesn't value all human life. Because I thought when I signed up to be an environmentalist and advocate for the planet, it was to make a more hospitable and equal planet for all people, for all animals. It's not just about conservation of animals. I was doing this work because I want everyone to have clean air, clean water, and green spaces. So I woke up to the painful reality that that was not the case in a lot of environmental organizations, and many organizations were silent. So I started talking about intersectional environmentalism, and I don't know why or how, but there were hundreds of thousands, which turned into over 1 million people when I posted about intersectional environmentalism and to take a pledge to join me that said that they were ready and that's what they wanted to do, or that's what they've always been doing. And they wanted to leave behind whatever old type of environmentalism that wasn't focusing on that. And so many people wanted to learn about the history of the environmental justice movement. They wanted to learn about diverse environmental leaders and organizations that have been there for a long time that they can support. So I didn't know what to do. I just started wondering, okay, it's the pandemic, we're inside. Right now I'm furloughed. Patagonia asked me to come back. I had a tough decision to make, and I decided to just quit my job. I was on unemployment at the time. And so are all the co-founders of our org, because when again in history, I mean, I hope it happens again, but will suddenly 1 million people be asking to learn about intersectional theory, environmentalism, and environmental justice history? So we created this organization called Intersectional Environmentalist to just get these resources to people as soon as possible. So showing them the different organizations in different states and around the world that are led by people of color, that are have queer leadership, have women leadership, etc. So people could support them and not just the big green. So those are like the Sierra Clubs of the world. They're good people, but support more organizations than, you know, just them. And then we were also just trying to get as much research as we could out there, just so people understood why environmental justice is so urgent. So that's the story behind IE. And at the same time, I was writing the book, which was a lot, but also easy to do side by side because we're doing so much research trying to get introductory information out to people about environmental justice. But yeah, that's a little bit of the story about how the org started. And now we're a 501c3 organization, and we have a team of about 10 people. Yeah, I would say the organization in particular, we definitely want to have more in real life activations, and also really we're kind of movement connectors, I would say. So we're here to direct people to the local orgs in their community that they can support and volunteer with, etc. Because environmental justice just varies so much depending on where you are. So we really want people to get local, act locally. I think we also really just want to help change the understanding gap of what environmentalism is and what it can look like. Um, so yeah, like it's really exciting when curriculums are changing, and they're using some of our resources and things like that. So yeah, that's the next step. Hopefully, just rocking the educational system to make sure that environmental justice is mandatory. I think the Sierra Club is a good example for a couple reasons. Never would I have thought that they would release an article about John Muir and his racist tendencies towards Indigenous folks. And that, I think, woke up a lot of other environmental orgs that have a similar history. The conservation landscape in the United States has a lot of really problematic roots, and that's just because even the formation of parks was, in some regards, violently taking away land from Indigenous folks, um, and barring them from their, ancestral lands. So to have the Sierra Club really have to have some sort of internal reckoning to talk about their history, not only internally and publicly. I know they also, and this is at the like headquarters though. I don't really know too much about their structure. I'm sure there's a lot of employees, so it's probably a lot of stuff going on. But there are a lot of employees within the organization that rose up and wanted to talk to leadership about what they had experienced. So the Sierra Club, they did hire a lot of consultants that they were working with for months to kind of reshape things. So hopefully, that's happening. But in addition to that, I think the biggest learning lesson that they have done is wealth redistribution. A lot of the big green organizations are bringing in over $100 million per year, sometimes $200 million per year. And Black-led environmental organizations receive less than 2% of philanthropic funding, and the numbers are similar for Indigenous communities, etc. And it's also mostly male leadership. So while they have a really activated donor base, which makes sense because they were formed during a time where, I don't know, the first people were really I talk about it in the book, but the Earth Day movement had like 20 million people. So a lot of people were looking at these historic environmental clubs, and they've just been donating ever since. And these smaller orgs, we don't have the infrastructure to build that donor base. So with wealth distribution, they are funding organizations like IE and smaller organizations and giving us the resources and helping us when they can so that we can become larger in scale. And I think a lot of these historic organizations should do that. They should try to change, their scope to make sure they're prioritizing diversity. But in the meantime, what they can do is create a very collaborative environmental community and help support organizations that are emerging, that are led by people of color, that know what they're doing and they just need more resources. I think that's the number one thing these historic organizations can do. I'd say at an individual level to start local because I feel like there's much more impact that way and you can really feel it. So yeah, even just volunteering. I remember I volunteered to plant some trees in Los Angeles with a tree planting org, and it just felt so fulfilling because they were going where they needed to be. Like I wasn't just planting trees in a forest, which is also a beautiful thing to do, but planting trees in an area that needs improved air quality because of systemic and structural racism and things like that. And really just figuring out what's going on in your local community. When I lived in Ventura, I didn't know until I started following a local climate justice org on Instagram that they were trying to build like a power plant really close to an elementary school. So all these people were trying to rise up because their children go to this school and they don't want this huge power plant. I remember they had kids line up and hold hands, and there was maybe like 30 kids between the school entrance and the entrance to the power plant. So I went to a protest because I found out it was happening. And you'd be surprised what's happening in your own backyard or just 10 minutes down the highway. So, really, just trying to get acquainted with what those issues are and just using your skills to help out, which could really, honestly, I know sometimes people like to downplay the importance of amplification, but sharing on social media, so easy. A first click that you can do, donating if you can, but raising awareness is also incredibly important, especially with local issues, because people tend to get enraged about local issues. If you're talking to people in that community and you're like, did you know there's a power plant that's being built by our children's school or something like that? You'll be surprised at the local momentum and how that can change things. Say thank you so much for holding space for me to talk today, and also everyone's comments. That makes me really happy that you all were like answering questions for each other, and I think it just reaffirms that we are the bearers of our own solutions, and those solutions can be found in community when we come together locally. So I thought that was just like a really beautiful thing to see kind of happen even in this space. I don't know if you all know each other, but maybe you don't, but I thought that that was a really great act of community care. But yeah, I hope I see you all if I'm ever in Utah. And if you in the back are ever in Ventura, let me know.
I will.
Bye, everybody. See ya.
The only thing I need, never ever thought I'd find something